Last week we talked quite a bit about Imago Dei, that is image of God, and a little bit about personal identity over time, and some of the problems that have been developed philosophically and theologically in order to kind of motivate a different way of thinking about what it is to be human, or to be built in the image of God, not so much as necessarily capacities or abilities that we have, but rather as vocation. Um, this week we're talking a little bit more about human nature, uh, and we're going to enter the conversation really with the tradition. And so throughout this quarter we've talked a lot about sort of pre-enlightenment, sort of pre-modern thought, and then enlightenment thought, and we've kind of sort of juxtaposed these, kind of played them off against each other. And then we've kind of developed something like a contemporary account, or like a way forward that acknowledges the strengths and the deficiencies of both, and tries to forge kind of a synthesis. And we've even talked about the way that Thomas Aquinas developed a synthesis between Augustinian Christianity and Aristotelian philosophy as a way to take the best of all the domains of human knowledge and kind of put them together and then move forward. Similarly, our attempt at doing kind of contemporary theology is to acknowledge the weight of the tradition, to recognize kind of where it's pushed, and then to recognize some deficiencies and to move forward. And the way we've typically done that is to recognize the stark difference between sort of pre-modern and then Enlightenment modern thought, and then, I don't love the term postmodern, but wherever we are in contemporary isms, ways to get Christianity and Christian thought to forge ahead. So in keeping with the heritage, recognizing problems, and then developing constructive solutions. And so today we're going to do that with human nature. And human nature, it's less of a pre-modern versus Enlightenment, really, and it's more of a almost neuroscience, philosophy of the 20th century, and then what happens with the 20th century and the sciences, and how that changes the way that we think about human nature. And so the way it works is this. Classically, Christianity all the way, really very almost uniformly throughout the tradition, has given a dualist account of human nature. Sometimes you'll get a tripartite view of human nature, but for our philosophical purposes, it really usually boils down to something like dualism. And typically in the tradition, this is mind-body dualism. And this is most classically formulated by René Descartes, who was a French philosopher. And he, through a number of thought experiments, kind of posited the idea that whoever I am, the I, when I say I, is not really referring to this body, right? This body is not me. Rather, me is my soul, or my intellect, my mind, something like that. And so there's some really common sense ways that he could motivate this. Like he can, there's thought experiments where you could say, well, imagine that you're you, and you replace all your body parts with robot body parts. Well, as long as you're still saying I, even though your body's entirely changed, it seems like you haven't changed. And so there's this intuitive sense that whoever I am is more than just the sum of my parts, and is in some way distinct from the physical body that I inhabit. Now, Descartes didn't invent this. It's really classically sort of developed by Plato. Plato's the first really true dualist in the at least Western intellectual tradition. And Plato suggested that there's this immaterial world, the world of souls, and in his language forms, and there's the physical world. And there's some way in which what goes on in this soulish world impacts the physical world. And the locus of this, in our experience, is really the human person. The human person is this unity, this meeting between soul and body. And so you might think of it as sometimes the phrase "the ghost in the machine." Right? There's this ghost somehow that's connected in some way to this body, and is sort of in control, as it were. And if you think about it, it's a little bit of a strange notion, because if something is truly immaterial, it's hard to know how it's interacting with the material world, right? When we investigate, especially with the sciences, the material world, it appears as if material causes create material effects. Um, if you want a billiard ball to move, you need to hit it with another billiard ball. Conservation of energy, physical laws, those types of things. It's hard to imagine how you could make a billiard ball move just by, thinking about it. And so there's a little bit of an issue there. How is it that this immaterial stuff and this material stuff interact? This is called the problem of interaction, and it's a very, very strong objection to the notion of mind-body dualism. If there is this ghost, how is it that the ghost is controlling the machine? How is it that there's this immaterial thing that somehow, using this body sort of like a robot, kind of the remote controls? How does that work? How does something immaterial affect something material? Now, that's not the only problem. It actually, and in fact, it leads to the second problem, which really has strongly been developed in just the last 50 to 60 years. And this is the problem that's come about with the development of the neurosciences. And it's really been brewing for a good 100 years. We talked a little bit last week about Phineas Gage, who suffered a very powerful brain damage. A pipe went through his head, and it seemed to drastically change his personality. And one of the things that was a fallout from his story, and scientists kind of interacting with it and dealing with it, is a stronger correlation between when I say whatever I'm referring to when I say I, and the human brain. Now, our understanding of the brain is probably still pretty new. We've made some incredible advances. They're amazing. My guess is that 50 years from now, people will look at the neuroscience of the early 21st century and be like, had a lot to learn there, fellas. So I don't think that we're by any means, all the way there. But I do think that there is an interesting, we do seem to have some very strong correlations between brain activity, neural networks firing and working, and human thoughts and rationality and emotions and decisions, and all of the things that we think of as our mental life, what's going on in our minds. And so there seems to be this very strong correlation between an actual material thing, the brain, and what we think of as I, or what traditionally was called the soul. And this brings up a big question. Is it possible that when I say I, what I'm really referring to is not some immaterial ghost, not some immaterial soul, but really just, my brain? That I equals brain. And that's a big issue, and we know this intuitively. We recognize the fact that we're somehow our body, our embodiedness very much impacts our mental life. Remember, we talked about the problem of interaction, right? How is it that something immaterial affects something material? Well, the problem goes both ways. How is it that something that's material, namely this body, can so dramatically impact what seems to be immaterial, that is our soul? Why is it that damage to the brain seems to impair the capacities or abilities of a soul? So in Phineas Gage's case, a part of his brain was damaged, and suddenly he had a major inability to control himself, and he also exhibited radically different personality traits. Likewise, we know that when people are undergoing extraordinary physical duress, in some cases torture, we know that their minds change, their opinions and thoughts and beliefs change because of physical duress, because of pain. And that seems strange, right? If the soul is immaterial, if it has nothing to do with material stuff, then why is it that pain can change minds? Why is it that brain damage seems to impair our cognitive faculties? Those should be differentiated. Interestingly, this points us in a direction. When Christianity was first being developed, it developed in the context of other religions and other philosophies based on a lot of Neoplatonic thought. A lot of them we've come to call Gnostic. Gnosticism. It was one of the very first species and really clusters of heresies against which Christian theology had to be vindicated. And we've talked a little bit about the second century apologist Irenaeus in this class. Irenaeus really catalogs quite a bit of what Gnostic thought is and how it is that it departs from apostolic doctrine, the teaching of Jesus and the apostles. And one of the interesting things about Gnostic belief is that it not only posits a radical dualism, but it radically prioritizes the mental or the immaterial over the physical. Such that in some Gnostic thought, really what religion is about is escaping the physical to move to the realm of the soul, to move to the realm of the immaterial. And so the body is almost like this cage or this prison in which the soul is imprisoned. And in some ways, death is actually a good thing, or at least some very radical kind of asceticism that punishes or disciplines the body such that the soul is freed from the prison. And you'll get this in quite a bit of Gnostic thought. And it's so interesting that in the wake of a really strongly defined Cartesian dualism, that something very similar happened in Christianity, in the 1600s and later, that again radically prioritized. And I mean, I guess it was probably before Descartes as well, but there's this strain that's gone throughout Christianity that radically prioritizes the immaterial, the life of the soul, of heaven, the other world, something like that, to whatever's going on in the body. That there's this very strong conceptual distinction between the immaterial and the material, and a real strong favoring or prioritizing of the value of the immaterial over the material. And in some ways, I think that we can say that while not Gnostic while not dogmatically Gnostic, there has always been a tendency in Christian theology and philosophy to there's been a Gnostic temptation, as it were, to radically devalue this life and the body and embodied living for the sake of radically prioritizing or super valuing the immaterial and the heavenlies and the not this stuff. And so I think that right there should give us some pause and make us think that maybe we should at least be hesitant about our commitment to a dualistic notion of human nature. That wherever we have this really strong, thick divide between the mental and the physical, to the point that we talk about the immaterial and the material, and as soon as we get strongly in that camp, where we're really, really strongly prioritizing one or the other, or at least really making strong distinctions between the two, we're in danger. I think we're very much in danger of alternatively a kind of Gnosticism that really hypervalues the immaterial, next world, heavenly, or for that matter its converse, which is a hypervaluation of this world and needs now and meeting physical needs as opposed to spiritual needs. Both of these I don't know if we want to call them heresies, but both of these distortions of classical Christian doctrine come about or are possible because we make a strong distinction between the mental and the physical, because we make a strong dualism. This is a very practical it's a practical result that comes from a strongly dualistic philosophy or theology about human people, human nature. And so it's something to resist. So if the classical view of humanity is dualistic, strongly dualistic, in the last 100 years, especially in secular philosophy, there has been a major push towards if you think of the divide, right, with the immaterial up here and the material here, it's just to get rid of all of this up here, just to ignore it, to say that it's not real, to the point that you have quite a few people who are ultimately what we call reductive physicalists, or reductive materialists, meaning that they don't think that there's anything in the universe except for physical stuff. And moreover, not that it's just that the universe is composed of physical stuff, but that anything that appears or feels or seems like non-physical stuff to us is illusory. It's not real. It can be explained or reduced in terms of chemical equations and interactions between particles. There's nothing that's left on that side of the divide, the mental, soulish, immaterial side of the divide. Now, obviously, this is pretty problematic, and I think that there's definitely a movement away from really strong definitions of materialism, physicalism in secular philosophy, for the very reason that it's so strongly counterintuitive to our notions of things like consciousness. The very sense that I have an experience of being me in this moment. I am, and I know what that feels like. This bubbling up of mental processes and thoughts and properties. That's a very strange thing. And it seems very strange to say that there's nothing other than just chemical reactions, that somehow this is just an emanation. You'll call some people will talk about emergence or emergent soul, emergent dualism. That somehow if you just put the chemicals and the particles in the right combinations and move them in the right ways, that suddenly consciousness happens. That's a very, very strange notion. And whatever else we're going to say about cutting off this mental, cognitive, immaterial side of human nature in favor of the material, we have to deal with this problem of consciousness. And the problem that follows after that is freedom. I mean, it really does seem like we're free. It seems like, we qualified that last week. We talked about some of the ways in which we're perhaps not as free as we might think we are, but there does seem to be a place for human will and a place for human reflection and thought that changes our direction based on things that we've considered or decided or thought about. And if you take both of those things in tandem, and to say nothing of our spiritual inclinations, it just seems like a really strongly reductive, there's nothing but physics. That just seems like it overstates the case. And it seems like it swings wildly in the other direction. Whereas before, you have this hyper-Gnostic temptation to all we're talking about, the only thing that matters is the immaterial and what's up there and the heavenly stuff. And then there's just this radical swing towards, no, in fact, the mental is illusory entirely. The only thing that matters is the physical. That's all there is, and everything else is just it's just hand waving. It seems as though philosophy has gone from here all the way over here, and it's lost something. And of course, as Christians, every Christian is to some extent a dualist because we believe in God, and it's hard to say that God is. I mean, we say that God's spirit. Hard to know exactly what that means, but it certainly means something different than the regular particles and physics that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Whatever we're going to say God is somehow distinct from that. And that means that every Christian has in some commitment to something on this side of the line, something soulish, cognitive, something that's not just stuff, at least as we normally think of it. So we're all committed to that. So we can't get on board with this kind of reductive physicalism, but at the same time, we kind of see the problems and some of the dangers of this really hyper-Gnostic dualism. All this to say that if we're going to develop a constructive account of human nature, we have to kind of put these two poles back together. In our metaphysics, that is, in our ontology, in our categorization of what is in the world, we may want to say that there's actually this whole materialism thing is very, very compelling. That really we in the tradition we've probably undervalued or made importance of the physical stuff. The physical stuff really is responsible for a lot of what goes on in the universe. We might want to say something like the brain really is what causes the emergence of consciousness. It really is a place where these complex interactions somehow develop a sense of the self or the I, that the brain really, really matters when we talk about me or I. And we might want to not stop with the brain. We want to say that the whole human body, the human beings, are necessarily embodied, planted in stuff. And if this seems a little strange to some of you, well, I would say that the resurrection should sound really strange too. Because the Christian proclamation is not that when you die, your soul is freed up and floats up into heaven, and that's it. That's the win. That is not Christianity. Christianity is the belief that when the Lord returns, there will be a resurrection of bodies. Now, the bodies won't be exactly the same as they were. I grant you that. They're a glorious body. They're glorified in some way. Maybe we can take a look at some of the interesting accounts of Jesus' own resurrection and say it wasn't just normal physical stuff there. It wasn't a reanimation of a corpse. Jesus wasn't it wasn't like he died and then he came back just as he was right before he died. That wasn't what happened. There was some transformation that went on, but it was a bodily transformation. It wasn't something that happened outside the body, off into nowhere land. Rather, the body itself seems to be very, very important in Christian proclamation, to the point that burial was something that mattered to Christians. And maybe we're less concerned about that, and there's been some theologians who say, no, God can recreate the body from the four winds if God needs to. But you can see the impulse of wanting to bury the dead, because this body, re-energized, revitalized, given new life, new glorified life, but this body is coming back. We have very, very strong reasons to think that that the Bible teaches that human life is meant to be stuff life. It's bodied life. It's here. It's physical. It's not meant to be abstracted from the physical. It's not meant to be off in la-la land without body. That's Gnosticism. That is not biblical doctrine. The Hebrew notion of the body, if you look in the Old Testament, you're just not going to find a body or a human life that's somehow abstracted from the body. This is why the psalmists are concerned about going down into the pit. Whether that's death or something, but whatever it is, it's a sense that without this world and interacting with it, with these hands and with these eyes, without that, human life's not complete. It's not what it was supposed to be. And so we want to say that the scriptures push us very, very hard against any notion of a strong Gnostic distinction, Gnostic type dualism between the mental and the physical. The scriptures are all about being embodied. In fact, if you want to read more about it, Joel B. Green has a book about souls, human body and souls, or I can't remember what he calls it, but it's a fascinating book. It looks at all these different texts in the New Testament and shows how even in the New Testament, even in places where when we traditionally read it, it sounds very dualistic because of the way our ears hear it. If you just get back and you get back into the categories that Paul, for example, was working with, you realize that it's a much more complicated notion of the relationship between the mind and the body in the New Testament that's very much in keeping with this embodied kind of Hebrew Old Testament way of looking at human life. Paul's not a Platonist. Paul does not, he's not thinking very, very strictly, oh, here's my soul and it just needs to get released from the body at death. That's not how Paul thinks. If that was how he thought, he would not have written 1 Corinthians 15. It just wouldn't work. So if we're going to have a constructive account, I think that we've got to stay away from these two poles. We've got to recover that really strong biblical notion of embodiment, of being a part of the physical world. But at the same time, we also have to really recapture. We can't go into too much of a materialist account, because if we're really, really strongly materialist, we're going to lose the importance of mental life and spiritual life. Spiritual life is embodied, but there's also something more than just what we feel and sense and experience. Part of the spiritual is contemplation of the divine, of the beautiful, something that isn't always there is a sense that we can abstract some of that from what we see and experience in the world, that there's more to the beauty of who God is, and a notion of God as beautiful than just what we can taste, smell, see, and touch. I would suggest personally, and we'll talk about this later, that that the beauty of the Trinity, that the triune nature of God is itself something really important in reality. And that truth is not something that you can see, smell, taste, touch, or hear. That is it's a mental, it's an immaterial, it's that kind of reality, and that's important. We want to hold that. We don't want to lose that. And yet we also want to preserve the importance of the body and embodiment. I'm not going to give you a straight up full-on ontology because I don't have one. But I will say that when Karkainen in your Creation and Humanity, in that book, I think chapter 12 we're reading this week, when he talks about multi-dimensional monism, right, which is just a really fancy way of saying, let's keep all of human life. Let's not lose the physicality. Let's not lose the mental. Let's not lose the emotional. Let's not lose the psychological, the spiritual. Let's hold it all as a unity, as a whole. Monism meaning oneness. Right? So there's a lot of different dimensions to this oneness, but it's one. And if you've been reading in Creation and Humanity, you can immediately sense behind that is a Trinitarian notion of what being is, right? Where God is multivariegated, Father, Son, and Spirit, and yet one, strongly unified. You can't just have the Father, you can't just have the Son, you just can't have just the Spirit. You have to have all of them, but they also have to be one. Multiple dimensions, one unity. I think VMK also talks about N.T. Wright talking about a differentiated unity. And again, differentiated, Father, Son, Spirit, but united, one God, three persons. That is the analogy by which we understand human nature. Even if that human nature, you want to think about it in a dualist sense, as soul and body, fine. But don't forget the unity. There has to be both. Personally, I tend to be a little more happy with something like emergent dualism or property dualism, where I don't know that we can reduce our psychological states to something physical that's going on. Rather, I like to think of them as their own domains. And so I tend to think of human beings as, intellectual, emotive, psychological, spiritual, physical beings. Right? There's my differentiated unity. And so when we hear love the Lord your God with all your soul, might, strength, whatever, however that gets put together, it's really like, it's I think even in the Message, I think Peterson sort of glosses that, is with everything you have. Love the Lord your God with everything that is you, your whole being. Right? To recognize that, yeah, there are different parts that we can identify and differentiate, but at the end of the day, when we're called to love, it's all of it together. It's one unified movement of an entire person towards God. And that, I think, is probably the way ahead for human nature. Advantage to this view. One of the most important things about a view something like this is that we get to remain agnostic about what's in the universe. And by that I mean we don't have to make a commitment to whether or not there's an immaterial part of human beings. There's like something that can, you hack my body up and there's something that's left, a soul or whatever. We don't have to commit to that. We have to say whatever it is that makes up a human being, or whatever human nature is composed of, the stuff of human nature, whatever that is, we can say that it has these parts, but all of those parts have to come together. All the parts that are mental or cognitive, intellect, emotions, psychology, spirituality, and the parts that are physical, the body, the everything our senses are, and it's all together. So we can remain agnostic about what's out there in the universe, what it is that actually makes us up, while describing how we're going to have to hold it together once we know. So if someone came along and said, I've proved it, there's an immaterial soul, we say, fine, there's an immaterial soul. and it has to be united to a body in just these ways to create this one nature, right? Or someone comes along and says, I've proved it, there's no such thing as a soul, it's just neurons. Say, okay, great, it's just neurons. But those neurons give rise to these independent things, this intellect and emotion and psychology and spirituality, and it is done in a body, and we've got to hold it all together. As long as we can hold that together, to have that, those multiple dimensions that make us up, and yet are united into one being, one embodied being, then I think we're actually on really, we're on good grounds. We're on good biblical grounds, and we're poised to be comfortable with whatever kind of metaphysics we encounter, whether or not someone is excited about the immaterial or the material. We're ready to say, fine, this is what it is to be human, because our account is derived not from philosophy or physics, but from the tradition of the scriptures and Christianity. It's a theologically motivated account of what it is to be human, rather than an account motivated by whatever this physicist or that philosopher thinks makes up the universe.